Welcome to another Abstract Pulse True Crime Marathon. Our first case, the Kansas City Butcher. He was a seemingly unremarkable man, running a curiosity shop in Kansas City. But behind the walls of his modest home, Robert Berdella orchestrated a nightmare few could imagine. Neighbors thought him eccentric, maybe odd, but harmless. In truth, Berdella's house became a silent theater of horror, where unsuspecting young men vanished, never to be seen alive again. This is the chilling tale of Robert Berdella, the Kansas City Butcher, a man whose twisted obsessions transformed his ordinary life into a gruesome labyrinth of torture and death. What led him to carefully catalog his atrocities? How did he lure victims into his trap? And how did it all unravel? Follow as we peel back the layers of one of America's most methodical and sadistic killers. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. was born on January 31, 1949 in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. Raised in a strict Catholic household, he was a shy, bookish child. His father was abusive and demanded perfection, instilling fear more than affection. Berdella's early years were marked by isolation. He wore thick glasses from age 5 and struggled with self-esteem. After moving to Kansas City in 1967 to attend the Kansas City Art Institute, Berdella developed a fascination with sadomasochism and began experimenting with violent fantasies. He was an excellent student but quickly grew bored, dropping out in 1969. He remained in Kansas City, opening Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, a shop selling oddities that attracted curious locals. By then, Berdella's interest in control had shifted from fantasy to a dark reality. Through the 1970s, Berdella's behavior escalated. He became a fixture in Kansas City's alternative scene, known for his unique shop and for helping troubled young men. But this kindness masked predatory intent. Berdella began drugging acquaintances, documenting their vulnerability. He kept meticulous notes on various substances' effects, building what amounted to a personal guide for incapacitating future victims. By the early 1980s, his fantasies had turned lethal. He started inviting men to his home under the guise of offering work or shelter. Once inside, they were drugged, restrained, and subjected to unimaginable abuse. Berdella's obsession with domination drove him deeper into a cycle of control that would leave 6 men dead between 1984 and 1987. Berdella's method was cold and deliberate. He often photographed victims before and during captivity, creating a chilling visual record. His log detailed every hour, what drugs were administered, what tortures inflicted, and his observations on victims' physical and mental states. Berdella forced victims to call him sir and issued punishments for disobedience. He experimented with electrical shocks, chemical burns, and other forms of torment, always documenting the reactions. He kept personal belongings, IDs, jewelry, and other items as trophies. His ability to maintain a facade of normalcy allowed these horrors to continue for years undetected. The precision of his record-keeping would later become key evidence against him, showing a level of premeditation rarely seen, even among serial killers. The 6 men known to have died at Berdella's hands were Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, James Ferris, Todd Stoops, and Larry Pearson. Each had struggles that Berdella exploited: homelessness, addiction, or financial hardship. He offered help, knowing they were vulnerable. Jerry Howell, just 19, was the first confirmed victim, abducted in July 1984. He was kept restrained and brutalized for days before being killed. Todd Stoops, whom Berdella had known previously, was kept captive for weeks before succumbing. Larry Pearson's death in 1987 was particularly cruel, ending only when Berdella fatally bludgeoned him after weeks of torture. These young men vanished quietly, with few connections strong enough to raise alarms, allowing Berdella to continue his spree uninterrupted. Berdella's reign of terror ended on April 2, 1988, when one of his captives, Christopher Bryson, managed a daring escape. After days of captivity, Bryson convinced Berdella to untie one hand, gained his trust, and leaped from a second-story window clad only in a dog collar. He ran to a nearby meter reader, who called police. Investigators entering Berdella's house found a scene of horror. Polaroids of victims in various states of torment, detailed torture logs, human remains, and tools designed for restraint and infliction of pain. The grisly evidence left no doubt. Berdella had orchestrated a calculated series of murders. Authorities spent days cataloging hundreds of items from his home, each piece a clue to the atrocities committed. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Berdella quickly confessed in a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He described his crimes with chilling detachment, recounting the methods he used to prolong suffering and exert complete control. On December 19, 1988, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for the murder of Larry Pearson, with subsequent guilty pleas leading to additional life sentences for the other killings. Berdella's confession shocked Kansas City. The mundane shopkeeper had been hiding a sadistic double life in plain sight. His case highlighted failures in how missing young men, especially those with troubled backgrounds, were overlooked by society, allowing predators like Berdella to operate undetected. Robert Berdella died of a heart attack on October 8, 1992, at the age of 43, just 4 years into his life sentence. His death brought little closure to victims' families, who struggled with the horrific details that emerged during the investigation. Berdella's home was demolished to erase the physical reminders of his crimes. His story remains a chilling lesson on how predators can hide behind ordinary lives and how society's blind spots toward marginalized victims can enable monsters to act without consequence. Today, Berdella's case stands as one of America's most detailed records of serial torture, a grim reminder that the worst horrors often unfold unnoticed in the quietest neighborhoods. The patients at Somerset Medical Center were dying quietly, too quietly. They were elderly, yes, sick, often, but something felt off-kilter in a way that nurses couldn't explain and doctors couldn't quantify. Their vitals would crash without warning. Lab results stopped making sense, and always nearby, calm and quiet, was the nurse, Charles Cullen. Kind eyes, steady hands, the kind of man you'd trust to sit beside your loved one in their final hours. He smiled, spoke gently, and offered comfort. But behind that sterile professionalism was something far darker. For over a decade, Cullen moved silently from hospital to hospital, cloaked in the chaos of the American healthcare system. He didn't kill in the shadows. He killed under fluorescent lights, with syringes and saline bags, hidden in plain sight. And by the time anyone truly noticed, the damage had already been done. He may have murdered hundreds. Long before he was a nurse, Charles Edmund Cullen was a boy shaped by absence. Born on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, he was the youngest of 8 children. His father, a bus driver, died when Charles was just 7 months old. His mother, to whom he was especially close, was killed in a car accident when he was 17. That final loss fractured something in him. He dropped out of high school shortly after. Cullen enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1978, seeking stability. Instead, the isolation and pressure seemed to deepen his unraveling. He began exhibiting bizarre behavior, once donning a surgical mask and gloves while manning missile controls, another time found curled up in a fetal position in a torpedo room. After several suicide attempts, he was discharged in 1984. The official reason was medical. Unofficially, it was clear he was mentally unwell. That same year, he enrolled in nursing school. By 1987, he was a licensed nurse, employed at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. It didn't take long for strange events to begin. Patients who had been stable would die unexpectedly. Medications would go missing. Colleagues suspected something, but Cullen was always just out of reach, soft-spoken, helpful, seemingly competent. Over the next 16 years, Cullen bounced from hospital to hospital, always under a shadow. Whenever suspicions grew, he resigned before he could be fired. Red flags followed him, but the healthcare system failed to connect the pattern. At times, he was even given neutral or positive references. His personal life showed similar cracks. His wife filed for divorce in 1993, alleging bizarre behavior, burning family belongings, abusing pets, and spiking drinks. Still, he kept getting hired. Each new hospital brought new victims, and no one, not administrators, not co-workers, not even the families of the dead, understood that they were witnessing one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The pattern was simple, almost surgical. Cullen would target patients who were vulnerable, elderly, recovering, or simply inconvenient to hospital staff. He began using digoxin, a powerful heart medication, to induce sudden cardiac arrest. In other cases, he used insulin or epinephrine, quietly injecting lethal doses into IV bags or directly into patients. These substances wouldn't immediately raise alarms. Many victims were already ill, making their sudden deaths easier to write off. Cullen counted on this ambiguity. It became his cover. His first known murders occurred at St. Barnabas Medical Center in 1988. Several patients died unexpectedly during his shifts. When an internal investigation uncovered a suspicious spike in digoxin levels in autopsied bodies, Cullen resigned. There was no criminal charge, no formal accusation, just a quiet exit. From there, he moved to Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, where the pattern resumed. In 1993, an elderly woman reported that a sneaky male nurse had come into her room late at night and injected her with something. She died hours later. Her family pushed for answers. The hospital performed a toxicology screen, revealing lethal levels of digoxin, but decided not to report it to the police. Once again, Cullen left before consequences could catch up. He found new work easily. His resume was clean. References stayed vague. Healthcare administrators feared lawsuits more than they feared suspicion, and that silence gave Cullen room to keep going. At Hunterdon Medical Center, he worked in critical care, where medication access was wide open and oversight was minimal. When patients died, no one looked too closely. In 1997, Cullen moved to Morristown Memorial Hospital. That same year, he attempted suicide twice and was briefly committed to psychiatric care. He confessed to feelings of hopelessness, but never to what he'd done. His psychiatric history, though extensive, didn't follow him between employers. Mental health privacy laws kept his records sealed, and so each new hospital welcomed him without question. By 1999, Cullen was working at Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He was supposed to provide palliative care, easing the suffering of elderly residents. Instead, patients began dying at an alarming rate. Cullen was caught tampering with medication carts, but no charges were filed. He resigned yet again and moved on. Each resignation was another opportunity, another hospital, another wave of deaths. No hospital wanted the liability, and so Cullen was allowed to vanish into the next facility, nameless among the night shift nurses, free to start again. By the early 2000s, Charles Cullen had perfected his method. He rarely targeted specific individuals for personal reasons. Instead, his victims were often selected based on opportunity, patients he had easy access to, whose deaths wouldn't raise alarms. Many were elderly, some were recovering, others weren't even in critical condition. Cullen believed he was ending suffering, but many of his victims were not terminal. Some were even on the mend. His primary tools were digoxin, insulin, and epinephrine. These drugs, in the right doses, could save a life. In Cullen's hands, they became silent killers. He would slip them into IV bags, contaminate medication drawers, or inject them directly into saline lines when no one was watching. The effects were quick, but not immediate. A patient might crash minutes or hours later, with symptoms that mimicked natural decline. To the untrained eye, it looked like bad luck. But when viewed in sequence, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Cullen grew increasingly bold during his time at Lehigh Valley Hospital in St. Luke's. He began targeting multiple patients in a single week. In one case, he admitted to entering a patient's room and injecting their IV line while they were unconscious. In another, he added digoxin to a medication bag intended for an entirely different person. Even staff he worked with were unknowingly administering his poison doses. The death toll climbed. Behind closed doors, hospital administrators whispered. Quiet internal investigations were launched, but they rarely led anywhere. Cullen had become skilled at resigning just before questions turned into consequences. He even started altering medical records, erasing logs, tampering with dosages, deleting signs of his presence. He was methodical, cold, careful. In 2002, Cullen secured a job at Somerset Medical Center. It would be his last. Within months of his arrival, the hospital began seeing a sudden rise in code blues, emergency responses to patients in cardiac arrest. Nurses noticed Cullen often appeared nearby during these events, even when he wasn't assigned to the patient. Lab results showed spikes in digoxin and insulin levels in multiple victims. Still, there was no proof, not yet. Cullen's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He accessed patient files without cause, loitered in restricted areas, and once was found in a medication room with syringes he wasn't authorized to have. A pharmacist raised concerns. Then another nurse did. The hospital finally reached out to the New Jersey Poison Control Center. What followed would finally crack the case open, but only after at least 16 patients had died under his care at Somerset alone. By then, Charles Cullen had murdered for 16 years. Among the victims at Somerset was Reverend Florian Gall, a beloved priest recovering from a minor health complication. His condition had been improving, and he was expected to be discharged soon. But suddenly, his heart stopped. The toxicology report showed a fatal level of digoxin, one that had never been prescribed. His family pushed for answers, but they weren't alone. Gall wasn't the only patient to crash under odd circumstances. Several others, Dorothy Oltmans, Zenon Kurilas, and Ottomar Schramm, all died within months of Cullen's arrival. Some had been talking to family hours before their death. Others had shown clear signs of recovery. The deaths felt random, inexplicable, and always came back to one constant: Charles Cullen. Behind the scenes, the New Jersey Poison Control Center began compiling data. They flagged the unusual frequency of cardiac arrests and the presence of medications that hadn't been ordered by physicians. A toxicologist named Dr. Stephen Marcus became one of the key players in connecting the dots. He urged Somerset administrators to act, but the hospital hesitated, fearful of lawsuits, reputation damage, and public backlash. Eventually, they reached out to law enforcement. The Somerset County Prosecutor's Office opened a formal investigation. But Cullen wasn't yet aware. He continued showing up for work, tending to patients, moving between wards. While investigators worked quietly, the hospital brought in a nurse named Amy Loughran, a colleague and friend of Cullen's. She was asked to wear a wire. Loughran had noticed Cullen's strange behavior for months, but hadn't dared voice her suspicions. When police approached her, she agreed to help. Using her access as a fellow nurse, she reviewed medication records and patient logs, discovering alarming patterns that directly tied Cullen to multiple deaths. The wire recordings captured Cullen speaking in vague, evasive terms about helping patients die. He never admitted exact numbers or details, but the walls were closing in. On December 12, 2003, Charles Cullen was arrested at a restaurant in Somerville, New Jersey. During his initial interrogations, he remained tight-lipped, but over time, perhaps out of guilt or exhaustion, he began to talk. Slowly, methodically, he described injecting patients with lethal doses of drugs. First dozens, then scores, then hundreds. He confessed to at least 40 murders, but claimed the real number was closer to 40 per hospital, across 10 institutions. That would place the victim count somewhere between 300 and 400, though many remain unverified due to missing records, cremations, and time. The sheer scale of it was staggering, not just in lives lost, but in how long it had gone unnoticed. For 16 years, Charles Cullen had walked the halls of hospitals, undetected, unchallenged, and unrepentant. Charles Cullen's arrest sent shockwaves through the medical community. Hospitals scrambled to review old records, trying to determine how many of their own patients had died during his tenure. Families were notified, death certificates were re-examined, but the truth was buried in incomplete files, undocumented injections, and systems that had never anticipated a serial killer wearing scrubs. In 2004, Cullen pleaded guilty to the murders of 13 patients and attempted murders of 2 others in New Jersey. Later, he pleaded guilty to additional charges in Pennsylvania, bringing his known tally to 29 confirmed victims. In return for his cooperation, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. But Cullen's admissions didn't stop with the court's charges. In interviews, he hinted that the actual number of deaths was far higher. He told investigators he couldn't even remember all the names. During his court appearances, Cullen remained mostly emotionless. He spoke in a flat, detached tone, occasionally muttering responses. When asked why he did it, his explanations were hauntingly simple. He claimed he wanted to end suffering. He insisted he believed some patients were beyond help, that he was easing their pain. But many weren't terminal. Some weren't even in serious condition, and he often made no attempt to get a second opinion. He simply decided, on his own, who would live and who would not. The families of the victims sat in courtrooms and listened to the man who had stolen their loved ones. They heard the flat confessions, the emotionless admissions, and they watched as Cullen, again and again, refused to give them closure. In one court session, when asked if he had anything to say, Cullen repeatedly muttered, "Your Honor, you need to step down," over and over. It was the only phrase he would say. He offered no apology, no explanation beyond the chilling minimalism of his earlier interviews. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. That means he will never leave prison. His confinement is at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, where he remains under constant observation due to his history of suicide attempts. After the sentencing, many hospitals quietly reviewed their hiring practices. Policies changed, record-keeping became stricter, and states began pushing for better tracking systems of medical professionals involved in misconduct or suspicious deaths. But the damage had already been done. Cullen had moved through 10 hospitals across 2 states, and at every step, red flags were ignored, minimized, or buried under bureaucratic fear. In the end, Cullen wasn't caught because of some grand institutional revelation. He was caught because a nurse listened to her instincts and wore a wire. The case of Charles Cullen left a scar on American healthcare, a quiet warning hidden beneath hospital gowns and sterile corridors. He wasn't the kind of killer who left blood at a crime scene or taunted the police. He left behind charts, empty beds, and grieving families. His methods were clinical. His motives, clouded in self-righteous delusion, blurred the line between mercy and murder. In the years following his conviction, journalists, documentarians, and investigators tried to piece together the full scope of Cullen's crimes. But there are no grave sites to count, no forensic trail to follow. Many of his victims were cremated before foul play was even suspected. Some were never named. Hospitals, fearing lawsuits and reputational collapse, kept silent. The true number of those who died at his hands may never be known. In 2013, the case re-entered public consciousness with the release of The Good Nurse, a non-fiction book by journalist Charles Graeber. It detailed the exhaustive investigation and highlighted the courage of Amy Loughran, the nurse who risked everything to stop him. The story was later adapted into a feature film, further cementing Cullen's name in the grim catalog of American serial killers. But the media's spotlight also reignited uncomfortable questions. How could so many institutions have failed for so long? Cullen's case triggered reforms, albeit slowly. Hospitals began developing better medication tracking systems. Some states pushed for centralized databases to flag suspicious healthcare workers across state lines. Yet critics argue that, in many places, the fundamental weaknesses Cullen exploited still exist: overworked staff, fragmented communication, and systems that prioritize image over accountability. Charles Cullen remains in prison today. He doesn't give interviews. He doesn't write letters. He exists now in the silence he once hid behind, a nameless inmate in a system he once used to kill. His story isn't one of chaos or frenzy. It's one of methodical, invisible horror. A man who walked among the living by pretending to care for the dying. He wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was a man in scrubs, a nurse, trusted, welcomed, overlooked. And that's what makes his story so terrifying. In the silent stillness of the New Mexico desert, there stood a small white trailer, unremarkable from a distance, a relic of sun-scorched days and cold, endless nights. But those who dared step inside would find themselves in a place where nightmares weren't just born, they thrived. Locals spoke of a man who lived on the edge of Elephant Butte Lake, a man who moved through their quiet town like a shadow. He kept to himself, but there was something about his eyes, dark, empty, as if they stared right through the world and into something none of us could ever comprehend. When the truth finally emerged, it wasn't whispered rumors or fleeting suspicions. It was a revelation so chilling, it felt as though the desert itself had exhaled a long-held breath of dread. What lay inside that trailer was not a home, but a chamber meticulously crafted for one purpose: torture beyond imagination. This is the story of David Parker Ray, the man who built his own private hell and called it the Toy Box. David Parker Ray was born on November 6, 1939, in Belen, New Mexico. His childhood was turbulent. His father visited rarely and reportedly gave him magazines depicting bondage and sadomasochism when he was still in his teens. These early influences ignited Ray's obsession with domination and control. As he grew older, his dark fantasies evolved into carefully planned rituals. Ray worked as a mechanic and was considered polite, even quiet, by those who knew him casually. But inside his mind, he was engineering a perfect environment to fulfill his monstrous desires. By the early 1990s, Ray settled near Elephant Butte Lake. On his property, he transformed a white cargo trailer into what he chillingly called his toy box. The trailer's exterior gave no hint of what horrors waited inside. But once the door shut behind a victim, they were trapped in a soundproof chamber stocked with homemade torture devices, surgical tools, and an arsenal of ropes, chains, and pulleys. The walls were adorned with detailed diagrams of human anatomy, showing precisely where to inflict pain for maximum suffering. Notes describing his methods were tacked alongside these drawings. Every inch of the toy box was designed to strip away hope and humanity from whoever entered it. Though he lived in near seclusion, David Parker Ray did not act alone. His girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, played a crucial role in his crimes. She helped lure victims with offers of rides, or by pretending to befriend women in bars. Once Ray had a target in his sights, he would use Hendy's cooperation and his own manipulative charm to get them alone. From there, he employed powerful sedatives to incapacitate his victims. Drugs like sodium pentothal or phenobarbital left the women groggy, disoriented, and vulnerable. When they awoke, they would find themselves chained inside the toy box, the white trailer now transformed into their worst nightmare. Ray had a ritual for his victims. He would play a recorded message through speakers in the trailer, a tape he had carefully crafted over years. In it, Ray's voice calmly explained to the terrified women that they were now his captives. He detailed in clinical, matter-of-fact language what they could expect, describing the torture and training he intended to inflict. The message stripped away any last hope they might have clung to, forcing them to confront the reality of their imprisonment. Ray believed psychological domination was as important as physical torture. By informing victims of their fate in such a cold, detached manner, he sought to break their spirits before he laid a hand on them. Inside the toy box, investigators later found an array of restraints, including chains bolted to walls and a gynecological table modified with straps. Victims were often bound in positions that left them completely exposed and unable to move. Ray took pride in his homemade devices, many of which he crafted to prolong his victims' suffering. His collection included whips, clamps, syringes, and electrical equipment. Diagrams showing techniques for inflicting pain or causing paralysis were posted alongside detailed anatomical charts. These were not impulsive acts of violence. They were carefully planned and rehearsed performances of cruelty. Authorities believe that over decades, Ray may have tortured and possibly killed as many as 60 women, though the true number will never be known. Some victims who survived were released with no memory of their ordeal, the drugs wiping away the horrors they endured. Others were never found at all. Ray hinted to Hendy and other accomplices that he disposed of bodies by feeding them to wild animals or dumping remains in the lake, ensuring no evidence could be recovered. These confessions were chilling, but impossible to fully corroborate without physical proof. The nightmare continued until March 22, 1999, when one woman shattered David Parker Ray's illusion of control. Cynthia Vigil, a 22-year-old woman Ray had kidnapped and tortured for 3 days, seized a chance to escape when Ray accidentally left her chained but unattended while arguing with Cindy Hendy. Despite her injuries and wearing only a metal collar and chain, Cynthia managed to find the keys to her restraints, unlock herself, and flee the trailer. She ran naked and bleeding through the dusty roads of Elephant Butte until she found a mobile home. A startled resident took her in and called 911, sparking the beginning of the end for the toy box killer. Law enforcement quickly descended on Ray's property, and what they discovered inside the toy box defied belief. The white trailer contained a meticulously organized torture chamber stocked with whips, clamps, chains, saws, syringes, and dozens of homemade devices designed for inflicting pain. There were also mirrors positioned so victims would be forced to watch their own suffering. Investigators found videotapes labeled with dates and women's names or descriptions, but tragically, most of these women were never identified. It was clear Ray had been carrying out his crimes for decades without detection. In addition to the physical evidence, police recovered personal effects like jewelry and clothing from numerous unidentified women. This suggested many victims did not survive or were released with amnesia so severe they never reported the crimes. Investigators also seized Ray's audio tapes, including his infamous introductory tape, in which he told victims in chilling detail what they would endure. The tapes became crucial pieces of evidence, proving Ray's intentions beyond any doubt. Authorities spent months combing through every inch of Ray's property, searching for bodies or signs of burial, but found nothing conclusive. Ray's arrest and the gruesome discoveries inside his toy box shocked the nation. Media coverage exploded as details of his torture chamber and the possibility of dozens of missing victims came to light. The FBI issued appeals for missing persons reports from across the Southwest, hoping to match any of the personal items or faces from Ray's videotapes with unsolved disappearances. Yet despite exhaustive efforts, most identities remain a mystery. The sense of unease lingered long after Ray's capture, leaving locals and investigators alike to wonder how many people vanished without a trace into the desert's unforgiving expanse. With Cynthia Vigil's testimony and overwhelming physical evidence, prosecutors built a case against David Parker Ray. They charged him with multiple counts of kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy. Although murder charges were considered, they were never filed. Without bodies, authorities could not prove homicide beyond a reasonable doubt. Ray pleaded not guilty, and his trial began in 2000. But the legal process was fraught with complications. Mistrials, jury deadlocks, and procedural delays dragged the case out, causing further anguish for the victims and their families. Ultimately, Ray accepted a plea deal in 2001, pleading guilty to all charges related to 3 surviving victims, including Cynthia Vigil. The court sentenced Ray to 224 years in prison, a term that reflected both the severity and the sheer scale of his crimes. Cindy Hendy, who had cooperated with authorities in exchange for a lighter sentence, was sentenced to 36 years. She testified in chilling detail about Ray's methods and confessions. Hendy's release in 2019 reignited public outrage, as many believed she deserved to spend the rest of her life behind bars for her role in the torment of Ray's victims. Another accomplice, Dennis Yancey, was convicted of strangling a woman at Ray's direction and served time before being paroled in 2011. Despite exhaustive searches and multiple excavations around Ray's property and Elephant Butte Lake, no bodies were ever found. This left investigators with haunting questions. How many women did Ray actually kill? Were there other accomplices who escaped justice? Families of missing women across the Southwest still wonder if their loved ones were among Ray's victims, and some remain convinced their disappearances are connected to the toy box. The FBI's efforts to match items from the trailer to cold cases yielded few answers, leaving most victims' identities forever unknown. Ray died of a heart attack in May 2002, just a year into his sentence. His death robbed many families of the chance to confront him in court or find closure. It also meant the secrets of his crimes died with him, leaving countless unresolved mysteries buried in the sands of Elephant Butte. The toy box was dismantled and removed, but the terror it represented lingers. Even today, the thought of a quiet mechanic hiding a torture chamber in plain sight sends a shiver down the spine of anyone who dares to look into the abyss he created. Though the trailer has been dismantled and the property left to decay, the legend of the toy box killer endures. It compels us to remain vigilant, to look beyond the surface, and to remember that true evil often hides where we least expect it. As we confront the darkness in stories like Ray's, we also recognize the resilience of those who fight to survive it, and the need to shine light on every shadow to prevent such horrors from happening again. They called him the Vampire of Sacramento. But this was no nickname born from tabloid headlines or urban legends. This was a man who drank blood, who mutilated corpses, who believed his very organs were decaying inside him and that only fresh blood could save him. And in the winter of 1977, Sacramento, California, would become the hunting ground of Richard Chase. A gaunt, wild-eyed man whose descent into madness is one of the most disturbing sagas in American crime history. But before the blood, before the bodies, before the headlines, there was only silence, a quiet neighborhood, a front door left unlocked, and a predator slipping in under the California sun. This is the story of a man whose thirst could not be quenched, not with water, not with therapy, not even with murder. Richard Chase didn't kill for pleasure. He killed because he thought he was dying. And what makes his case so chilling isn't just the violence. It's the logic that drove it, the unhinged, twisted rationale that made him believe his crimes were necessary for survival. It began, as many of these stories do, with whispers no one heard, a troubled child, a family unable or unwilling to intervene. He was a loner, detached. By his teens, he was already showing signs of severe mental illness. He believed people were trying to poison him, that his heart would stop beating unless he drank the blood of animals. But as the years passed, animals weren't enough. In 1976, Chase was briefly institutionalized. Staff called him Dracula. He was caught smearing blood on his face, found with birds he had caught and killed in his room, and yet, he was eventually deemed not a threat and released. What followed was a rapid, horrifying escalation. Sacramento's cold season was just setting in when Richard Chase committed his first known murder. A drive-by shooting, seemingly random. A test, perhaps. A warm-up. But what came next was anything but random. On January 23, 1978, Richard Chase walked through a quiet Sacramento neighborhood. He wasn't looking for anyone in particular, only for a door that was unlocked. He believed that if a door was locked, it meant he wasn't welcome. But if it was open, that was an invitation. That morning, 51-year-old Teresa Wallen was at home, pregnant, alone. Her husband had just left for work. She was taking out the trash when Chase approached the house. The door was unlocked. What happened next is almost unspeakable. Chase entered, armed with a .22 caliber pistol. He shot Teresa in the hand, then in the head. She fell. He didn't stop there. He dragged her body into the bedroom. He retrieved a butcher knife from her kitchen and mutilated her. And then, he drank her blood. He used a yogurt cup as a makeshift chalice. He later told police he needed her blood because his own was turning to powder, that his stomach was backwards, that his heart would stop beating unless he replenished himself with human organs and plasma. This was no calculated killer. This was someone utterly consumed by delusion. But the results were every bit as horrifying as the most sadistic of murderers. Chase left fingerprints. He left footprints. He didn't care. The police were baffled by the sheer brutality. The scene looked less like a murder and more like a ritual. And he wasn't done. Just 4 days later, on January 27th, Chase struck again. But this time, the scene would be even more chaotic because there were multiple victims. Evelyn Maroth was a 38-year-old woman living in a quiet Sacramento suburb. On January 27, 1978, she was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew, David, while also watching over her own 6-year-old son, Jason. Her friend, Dan Meredith, had come by to check in. That morning, Richard Chase showed up at the front door. Like before, it was unlocked. What happened inside that house is one of the most disturbing mass murders in California history. Chase shot Dan Meredith first, killing him in the hallway. Then he turned his gun on Jason, the 6-year-old boy, and Evelyn. None of them were spared. But the most horrifying part wasn't just the killings. It was what Chase did afterward. He mutilated Evelyn's body in the bathtub. He drained her blood. He took organs with him. He defiled her corpse in ways so grotesque that even seasoned homicide detectives were left shaken. It wasn't just murder, it was consumption, desecration. And baby David? He vanished. At first, police didn't know what had happened to the child, but they feared the worst. And when they found a blood-stained box and diapers at the scene, the horror only deepened. Chase fled the house with body parts, leaving behind fingerprints, blood, and a trail of madness. The scene was chaotic, but it gave investigators a lead. The next day, they issued a bulletin, and a neighbor who had seen someone suspicious earlier that week came forward. The tip would lead them directly to Chase's apartment. When police arrived, what they found inside was a nightmare. Dishes soaked in blood, a blender stained red, pieces of flesh in the fridge. There were signs that Chase had been blending raw organs with Coca-Cola and drinking them. There was no longer any doubt. This wasn't just a murderer. This was a man utterly lost to delusion. A man whose mind had twisted so far inward that he no longer saw people as human, only as fuel. But even then, the full horror hadn't yet come to light, because baby David was still missing. 2 days after the mass murder at Evelyn Maroth's home, police arrested Richard Chase. He didn't resist. He was found wearing a blood-stained parka. In his pockets were Dan Meredith's wallet and a semi-automatic pistol, traced back to the crimes. When they searched his apartment, the evidence was overwhelming. Inside his fridge, they found parts of baby David. Chase confessed, but not in the way you might expect. He didn't see what he did as evil. He insisted he had no choice, that he was being poisoned by Nazis, that his blood was turning to dust, that his organs were decaying. He said he needed blood to live. At his trial, the defense argued insanity, and in any other case, it might have worked. But the prosecution painted a different picture. A killer who knew what he was doing, who bought weapons, who fled the scenes, who tried to avoid being caught. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. Richard Chase was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death in the gas chamber at San Quentin, but he would never make it that far. On December 26, 1980, Richard Chase was found dead in his cell. Suicide. He had stockpiled antidepressants given to him by prison staff and overdosed. He was 30 years old. His death, like his life, left behind more questions than answers. Was he a victim of untreated mental illness, ignored by a failing system? Was he born broken, or made that way by isolation, paranoia, and neglect? In the end, the case of Richard Chase is more than just a horror story. It's a haunting reminder that monsters aren't always born in the dark. They can emerge in plain sight, unnoticed until it's far too late. And sometimes, the scariest part isn't what they do. It's that no one stopped them. They called them the Chicago Ripper Crew, a group of 4 men who turned the streets of 1980's Chicago into a hunting ground. But this was no ordinary gang. This was a cult, a sinister brotherhood bound together by darkness and a thirst for evil that went far beyond mere crime. In the shadows of the Windy City, they prowled in a red van, searching for unsuspecting victims, while the rest of the city slept unaware of the nightmare riding through their neighborhoods. This is the story of how a city's overlooked terrors hid behind the ordinary, and how a single survivor's bravery would bring one of America's most twisted cults to light. The leader of this macabre assembly was Robin Gecht, a construction worker who had once been employed by John Wayne Gacy himself. Some would later speculate that Gecht learned more than just carpentry while working alongside one of America's most notorious killers. But while Gacy preferred to act alone, Gecht surrounded himself with followers, Edward Spreitzer and brothers Thomas and Andrew Kokorales. Together, they formed an unholy alliance that terrorized Chicago in a way few could comprehend. By day, they were the men you might see fixing up a neighbor's house, working construction, or sitting quietly in a diner. By night, they were something else entirely, a cult driven by dark fantasies, stalking the city's streets with an air of untouchable confidence. It wasn't just their brutality that made them unforgettable. It was the chilling precision with which they operated, and the twisted bond that kept them together. How could a group of seemingly ordinary men become one of the most feared murder rings in American history? The answer lies in the depths of their leaders' control, the cult-like rituals they performed, and the shocking details that would later emerge from police investigations. As whispers of missing women spread through the city, no one suspected a cult was to blame. The Chicago Ripper Crew had perfected their facade. Their red van became a phantom on the roads of Chicago, appearing and disappearing in the night, never staying in one place for long. Police were baffled as cases piled up with chilling similarities, yet leads were scarce. Each crime scene only deepened the mystery, and fear began to grip the city like a cold, unrelenting fog. Robin Gecht's hold over his followers was absolute. He convinced them that they were chosen for a higher purpose, that they were destined to carry out acts no one else would dare. His charisma was twisted into a weapon, and he used it to turn 3 men into loyal soldiers for his dark crusade. The Kokorales brothers, Thomas and Andrew, were willing to do whatever Gecht asked of them, even if it meant crossing lines most couldn't fathom. Edward Spreitzer, too, fell under Gecht's spell, joining them in their nightly prowls that would leave Chicago police chasing shadows. Meanwhile, the city's residents tried to go about their lives, but an undercurrent of dread began to take hold. Murmurs of a serial killer, or worse, a group, swept through communities already worn thin by economic hardship and rising crime. Friends warned each other to stay off darkened streets, to keep doors and windows locked, and to never walk alone at night. Yet despite the growing sense of danger, no one could imagine the true horror lurking beneath the surface. For months, the red van roamed free, its occupants seeking new victims, and all the while, Gecht kept his followers bound in secrecy, ensuring they would never speak a word of what they did under the cover of night. But it would only take one mistake, one survivor, to shatter the illusion of invincibility they had built around themselves. That moment was coming, and when it arrived, it would blow the case wide open. Her name was Beverly Washington, and she would become the key to unraveling the Chicago Ripper Crew's reign of terror. One fateful night, The crew thought they had claimed another victim, but Beverly survived. Left for dead on the side of the road, she somehow found the strength to crawl to safety and alert authorities. Her escape wasn't just a miracle, it was a turning point. For the first time, the crew's carefully constructed web of secrecy had a tear in it, and through that tear poured the horrifying truth. When police arrived, they were stunned by Beverly's courage and clarity. She provided a detailed description of the men who had taken her, the distinctive red van they drove, and even fragments of conversations she overheard in her captor's lair. Investigators realized they had something they had desperately lacked for months: a living witness who could point them straight to the predators. Detectives raced to connect Beverly's account with reports of missing women, and soon they had a suspect, Robin Gecht. As officers began surveilling Gecht, they uncovered a horrifying reality. His home, with its unassuming exterior, was a place of dark rituals. The attic was said to contain a makeshift altar, a place where Gecht and his followers carried out ceremonies to bond themselves in blood and secrecy. The more police learned, the more they understood this was no ordinary criminal operation. They were hunting a cult, one that thrived on fear and the belief they were untouchable. The investigation quickly expanded, and the red van, once a phantom, became the most wanted vehicle in Chicago. The police department mobilized with a sense of urgency not seen in years, determined to end the wave of disappearances haunting the city. With Beverly's testimony as their compass, detectives traced the crew's movements, interviewed those connected to them, and built a case that would reveal horrors beyond what anyone had imagined. As detectives closed in, they discovered the layers of deception Robin Gecht had woven around himself and his crew. Friends and neighbors described him as a quiet, polite man, someone who kept to himself and never drew attention. But behind that mask was a predator orchestrating a campaign of terror across the city. His followers, too, played their roles well, blending in among their communities as if nothing sinister lurked beneath their calm exteriors. Once warrants were issued, police stormed Gecht's home. What they found inside only deepened the darkness of the case. Though much was later kept from the public to spare the families of victims, it was clear from the start that what had taken place within those walls was the stuff of nightmares. Investigators found traces of the crew's rituals, unsettling writings, and chilling evidence that pointed to the group's obsession with power and control. They realized the red van wasn't just a means of transportation. It was a mobile hunting ground, a vessel of death that allowed the crew to strike wherever they pleased. Interrogations began, and one by one, the crew members broke. Under the weight of mounting evidence and intense questioning, they revealed details of their crimes that confirmed detectives' worst fears. The Cocorales brothers and Edward Spreitzer described nights spent driving through the city, searching for victims, and following Gecht's every command. Their confessions painted a portrait of a group consumed by darkness, bound by rituals they believed made them invincible. Yet despite overwhelming evidence and damning statements from his own followers, Robin Gecht maintained his innocence. He denied every accusation, refusing to acknowledge the horrors linked to his name. His chilling lack of remorse left detectives and prosecutors convinced they were dealing with someone who believed he was beyond the reach of law and morality. Someone who had built a cult of personality so powerful, it led 3 other men to carry out his twisted bidding. As news of the Chicago Ripper crew's arrests spread, the city collectively exhaled for the first time in months. But the sense of relief was tempered by the horror of what investigators revealed. The details of the crew's activities stunned even seasoned detectives. Chicagoans learned that a band of seemingly ordinary men had stalked their streets with unthinkable intentions, and that a single survivor's courage had been the key to ending their rampage. Neighborhoods once cloaked in fear began to stir with cautious hope, but the scars left behind by the crew's reign of terror would not fade quickly. The courtroom became the final stage for the Chicago Ripper crew's dark saga. Prosecutors laid out evidence that painted a picture of methodical evil, the red van's haunting presence, the cult-like loyalty of the crew, and the sinister leadership of Robin Gecht. Witnesses recounted chilling encounters, and investigators shared stories of nights spent piecing together the crew's movements. Every revelation drove home how close the crew had come to slipping away entirely, and how the city had been one step from allowing a group of predators to continue unchecked. Thomas Kokoralis, Andrew Kokoralis, and Edward Spreitzer faced the weight of the law for their roles in the crew's campaign of fear. Andrew Kokoralis would ultimately be executed, while Thomas Kokoralis and Spreitzer received lengthy prison sentences. Gecht, the man who had orchestrated the terror, was convicted on charges related to one of the survivors and sentenced to prison, though not for murder itself. His lack of a murder conviction remains a chilling reminder of how sometimes the legal system cannot perfectly account for the darkness lurking in a person's soul. Even as the trials ended and the crew was scattered to prison cells, the haunting legacy of the Chicago Ripper crew lived on. Families of the victims were left to grapple with grief, and the city itself was forced to reckon with the reality that a modern-day cult had flourished in its midst. The red van, once a ghostly presence in the night, became a symbol of terror etched into the city's memory forever. In the aftermath of the convictions, Chicago was left to piece together how such evil had thrived undetected for so long. Experts on criminal psychology weighed in, calling the Chicago Ripper crew one of the most disturbing examples of group psychosis ever recorded in the United States. Unlike most serial killers who act alone, these men fed off each other's darkness, emboldened by the shared belief that they were above the law and outside the bounds of morality. It was a sinister dynamic that showed how powerful and dangerous a leader's influence can be when combined with a group desperate for belonging. Journalists dove deep into Robin Gecht's past, uncovering his employment under John Wayne Gacy and reigniting speculation about how much the two killers might have influenced each other. Though there was never definitive proof that Gacy taught Gecht his methods, the connection fueled endless theories and dark folklore across Chicago. People whispered that the city had given birth not just to one monster, but to an entire generation of men molded by the shadows of its most notorious murderer. Meanwhile, the public struggled to understand how three men, the Kokoralis brothers and Spreitzer, could surrender their free will so completely. Documentaries and true crime shows would later explore whether they were victims of manipulation or simply willing participants in Gecht's twisted vision. The survivors' stories became vital reminders of resilience, proof that even in the face of unimaginable horror, there could still be hope, courage, and justice. As the years passed, many tried to forget the horrors of the Ripper crew, but reminders surfaced from time to time, reigniting old fears. Most haunting was the 2019 release of Thomas Kokoralis after serving his sentence. His freedom sparked outrage among victims' families and reignited debates over justice and rehabilitation. It was a chilling moment for Chicago, forcing the city to confront the painful reality that some nightmares never fully fade. Thomas Kokoralis's release after more than 3 decades behind bars became a lightning rod for controversy. Protesters gathered outside his halfway house, holding signs with victims' names and demanding answers. Families of the women the crew had targeted voiced their outrage to the media, questioning how someone involved in such unspeakable acts could ever walk free. News stations replayed old footage of the red van, and the chilling photographs of Gecht and his followers resurfaced, reigniting the city's collective memory of the fear that once ruled its streets. Journalists interviewed experts on criminal justice and rehabilitation, sparking heated debates about whether someone who took part in such dark crimes could ever truly change. Some argued that Kokoralis had served his time and deserved a second chance under the law, while others insisted that releasing him was a betrayal to the families forever scarred by the Ripper crew's rampage. As opinions clashed, one truth was undeniable. The shadow of the Ripper crew still hung heavy over Chicago, decades after their arrests. For the survivors and the families of the victims, moving on had never been easy. Each anniversary of the crew's crimes brought back painful memories, each news story reopening old wounds. But amidst the darkness, there were also stories of resilience. People like Beverly Washington, who had stared death in the face and survived, became symbols of strength and reminders that courage could triumph over terror. Their voices helped ensure the victims' stories were never forgotten, even as the city around them continued to change. As the story of the Chicago Ripper crew continued to circulate in documentaries, podcasts, and true crime discussions, it served as a chilling lesson about the dangers of unchecked influence and the horror that can lurk behind ordinary faces. The crew's reign had ended decades ago, but their legacy still echoed in the darkest corners of the city's collective memory, a haunting reminder of how easily evil can hide in plain sight. Thank you for tuning in. Keep your pulse steady and your eyes up. Subscribe for more haunting stories from the depths of the unknown.